The Choice of Hercules movie review. So this is a Japanese movie, actually. The English title is The Choice of Hercules, and as sometimes happens when these movies get retitled for an international release, the English title is completely different from the Japanese title. Japanese title is... Actually, I don't know how to read all of these kanji, but the Japanese title is something about the Asama Sanso Lodge incident. And this movie is a historical drama based on the Asama Sanso Lodge incident. So in order to review this movie, I guess I'm first going to have to do a brief history lesson here and explain what the Asama Sanso Lodge incident was. So, yes, this grew out of the Japanese student movement of the 1960s. This is something I've talked about at length in previous videos, and I'll try and keep myself brief here. So it's, yeah, in the US, of course, everyone knows about the 1960s and the student movement and the student protests. Sometimes people in the US forget or never get told that this was actually a worldwide movement. So countries all over the world, in Europe and South America and Asia, there were also simultaneous student movements going on there. It was kind of a worldwide thing. And in Japan, there was a very turbulent, very violent student movement that happened at the end of the 1960s. And in many countries, these student movement protests ended up resulting in some terrorist splinter groups in kind of the early 1970s. We had this a little bit in the US, but it was much more of a problem in Europe and in Japan. And in Japan, the terrorist kind of splinter group that resulted from the student movement was the Red Army faction, which was which had several incidents throughout the 1970s in Japan, and actually all over the world, because factions of the Red Army faction were involved with the Palestinian Liberation Organization or with kind of European leftist groups. Yeah, so there were different factions of this, of the Japanese Red Army. But at least one faction of the Japanese Red Army, they were a bit decentralized, or all these different groups that weren't really very well connected with each other. One faction was rather infamous for going up into the Asama Mountains in Japan, which are these very cold, snow-covered mountains. Sorry, I'm gonna have to move into the shower here, which is what I usually do when the baby starts crying. Yeah, at least one faction moved into the Asama Mountains in Japan, and was kind of holed out there for, I don't remember, several weeks, several months, during which they had these kind of bizarre purges, where they would kind of evaluate the commitment of various members or the ideological purity of various members. And members that were found to kind of not live up to the group standards were killed. I believe it's a little bit of a gray area, but I believe it was somewhat unintentional. They were just kind of tied up and left in the cold, with the result that they died. But 14 of them ended up dying in this way over kind of successive nights. Then the remaining members, for reasons actually I don't remember. Why did they do this? I don't remember. They took a lodge hostage. Why did they do that again? Were the police closing in on them at that point? I don't remember, but there was a mountain resort lodge, you know, kind of for tourists to come in and enjoy the mountains. And the Japanese Red Army took over the lodge, took the wife of the lodge owner hostage, and there was a standoff with the police. Now, at this point, the media got a hold of the story. And so the TV cameras and the media and everything were out there filming this standoff between the police and the Japanese Red Army, which was in the lodge. And this, I think this was 1972 that this happened. So this was some years before I was born. But when I was living in Japan, I lived in Japan for 8 years, from about 2001 to 2009. I would frequently see this on TV because this just became one of those iconic images from the 1970s in Japan. So, you know, like in the US, whenever they're doing a program on, you know, the 1970s, like, remember the 1970s music, and they show clips of like a discotheque, and they show clips of Star Wars, and they show clips of Nixon or something like that. You know, there are these classic iconic clips that come to symbolize the decade. In Japan, this kind of became one of those classic iconic visuals that symbolized the decade. So you would frequently see this on TV whenever they were talking about the 1970s. They just pull up this clip of the police at the standoff at the Asama Mountain Lodge. And there was also at one point a wrecking ball, like a crane with a wrecking ball, was used to smash in parts of the lodge. And this is always the part that they ended up showing on TV to kind of symbolize the incident. So it became known as the Asama Mountain Lodge incident. And it's just kind of iconic in Japan, or to symbolize 1970s in Japan. At the time of the incident, nobody knew about the purges that had happened previously. So those kind of 14 frozen dead bodies were all found after the incident, but they became a part of the story as well. Because this is so iconic, there have actually been a number of movies kind of made about this incident. I didn't review it at the time, but one I watched years ago was called Ame no Hikari, which was an attempt to try and kind of get behind the minds of the Japanese Red Army members. Because, you know, these all kind of started out as student radicals, right? So they're university students, kind of going through the university experience, mostly from middle-class backgrounds. So how did they get to the point where they kind of lost their minds and went through these kind of terrible purges? Ame no Hikari attempts to kind of evaluate these students. And it does so by being a film within a film. So it's a film about a director and actors making a film about the Red Army purges. So they'll kind of shoot a scene, and then they'll stop shooting a scene, and like the actor or actress will kind of try and talk about what they think their character's motivation was during this scene where the purges took place. It's a bit bizarre, but perhaps that's kind of it's a bizarre historical incident, so maybe that's kind of the only way you could do it justice. I don't know. The Choice of Hercules, the English title of the movie I'm reviewing today, I was aware of for a few years before I saw it. I saw it, you know, it was on the DVD shops when I was in Japan. I delayed watching it for a couple reasons. One is because I thought there's only so many movies a man can watch on the Asama Mountain Lodge incident. The other reason I was not particularly interested in this movie is because it was all from the perspective of the police. And my perspective, especially when I was younger, was I was kind of more interested in the student radicals. Certainly I was interested in the Japanese student protest movement. Certainly it's very hard to have sympathy for the Japanese Red Army because they had clearly lost their mind by the time we get to this point in history. But being kind of a leftist, I wasn't overly up for a movie that kind of showed it from the perspective of the law and order police. But one of my students really loved this movie, and he recommended it to me. He actually went so far as to loan me his personal copy of the DVD. And it's a Japanese movie, but it had English subtitles. So the moment I realized it had English subtitles, I was like, yeah, fair enough, I'll give this a watch. So, it turns out this is a fascinating movie. It's from the perspective of the police, but I had no idea that there was this much, what's the word for it, kind of bizarre arguing going on the police side of it. It turns out what nobody saw in front of the television cameras was that there was an ongoing turf war between the Nagano Prefectural Police and the Central Tokyo Police throughout this whole thing, which is kind of a Japanese thing, arguably, although there are bureaucracies all over the world. But in Japan, kind of bureaucracies kind of have their own kind of entrenched power struggles. And that's what kind of resulted here. And this movie is just kind of about that power struggle between the two bureaucracies. The Nagano Prefectural Police wanted to deal with it, the Central Tokyo Police wanted to take control. Inside the Central Tokyo Police, they gave a series of special promotions, specifically for this incident, so that they would outrank the Nagano Prefectural Police. But then because of these special promotions, the chain of command within the Tokyo Police wasn't clear. Now, the movie is all based off the memoirs of one of the members, I think of who was it? The Nagano Police? I read a review somewhere that said it was a little bit biased because it was based off this guy's memoirs. So it kind of is sympathetic to him and his division, and it makes all the other divisions kind of look petty and squabbling. But regardless, it's an interesting story. And according to this movie, there was just kind of one screw up after another behind the scenes dealing with this crisis. So to give an example, I was mentioning earlier that one of the iconic visuals from this incident was the police using a wrecking ball to kind of demolish parts of the lodge. Turns out that this wrecking ball thing was just an endless bureaucratic headache behind the scenes. So none of the police could operate the wrecking ball machinery. They just didn't have the technical knowledge. So they got someone from the construction crew to operate it. But then there was a debate about whether he could operate it because he wasn't part of the police. So finally they compromised and they agreed that he could do it if he wore a police uniform during the operation. But then they started arguing about whether he was going to wear the Tokyo police uniform or the Nagano police uniform. And then there were these power lines that were kind of in the way, and there was an agreement that the power lines would be cut so that they didn't interfere with the wrecking ball. But nobody cut them because of a miscommunication. And then they were using the wrecking ball at the same time they were using the police water cannon. They were using a water cannon against the radicals there. And then, because they were using the water cannon, the engine for the wrecking ball crane got flooded and the battery died. So it's just kind of one disaster after another. And even during the final rescue operation, when the police squads are swarming into the mountain lodge, the police are still arguing with each other as they're swarming into the mountain lodge to rescue the hostage. Mostly they're just shouting at each other, but there's even some brief physical altercations, kind of physical fighting as they're trying to take control of this mountain lodge. It sounds like comedy, and it is kind of, but for the most part it's played straight in the movie. Like they play it like a serious historical drama. It reminds me kind of Apollo 11 a little bit, in the sense that because you know the history, you know what the end is going to be, but they still are able to milk a fair amount of suspense out of each individual scene, because you don't know how these individual problems are going to be resolved, even though you know what the end of the story is going to be, the end of the big story. The Japanese Red Army are pretty much non-entities in this movie. You can kind of see the barrels of the guns that they are shooting, but the Japanese Red Army themselves are just kind of mostly just gun barrels. You don't really see their faces or get to know them as characters. There's no mention of the purges which preceded the hostage crisis. And again, because I think in real life, nobody discovered those purges until after the hostage crisis was over. There is one scene when the mother of one of the Japanese Red Army members is brought in and given a loudspeaker and allowed to kind of plead with her son to kind of stop doing this, which I'm assuming is historical. It's a rather poignant scene, and she kind of references some of the political things which are going on at the time. I think she says the world is changing. Nixon's and Kissinger are talking with Mao now, and they're referencing some of the political things which are going on at the time. I'm assuming that's historical. I don't really know. I didn't actually read the book on which this is based. I did read another book, though. Not the book on which this movie is based, but a book on the Japanese Red Army. It's an older book, but you can track it down probably through Amazon or Interlibrary Loan or something like that if you're interested, which is called Blood and Rage: The Story of the Japanese Red Army by William Farrell. Farrell. Now it's been a few years since I read that book, but I thought he mentioned that the lodge owner was killed during this incident. Somebody correct me if I'm getting the details wrong, but what I remember from the book is the lodge owner was about 30 or 31. So the lodge owner kind of thought that he was not that much older than the student radicals who had kind of taken over the lodge. And he wanted to be a hero. He had kind of visions of glory. So he kept trying to sneak through the police lines to negotiate with the Japanese Red Army. And the police kept catching him and kind of bringing him back, but he kept trying to sneak through again, and he would bring gifts of food to the Japanese Red Army. And then eventually the Japanese Red Army just shot him because they didn't know who he was and they didn't trust him, and he got killed. Now in the movie, at the end of the movie, there's a happy reunion between the between the lodge owner and his wife, and instead it's a random civilian who sneaks through the police lines and is killed by the Japanese Red Army. But I was just looking this up on Wikipedia just now, and Wikipedia also seems to say that it was a random civilian who got killed, who snuck through the police lines and got killed by the Japanese Red Army. So, I don't know, maybe I'm misremembering the book. There's very little information in English on the internet on this. I spent about 10 minutes just now trying to refresh my memory on this, or kind of search through, and I can't get any detailed information in English on what happened to the lodge owner behind this. So I could be wrong. If anybody knows, or if anybody knows where there's more information in English on this incident on the internet, let me know. Yeah, I don't currently have a copy of Blood and Rage, the book, with me. I'm just going off by what I remember. Yeah, so that's basically all I have for this one. It's an interesting movie. Give it a recommendation if you can track it down.